Neoliberalism should be seen as the contemporary form of capitalism. It's a state-driven project that has reshaped in a negative way how we are governed and the way we live our lives. How it became established is a story worth telling. For 3 weeks in July 1944, towards the end of the most destructive conflict in human history, the Allies, minus the Soviet Union, came together at Bretton Woods in the USA to lay the foundations of the post-war economy. They agreed a new monetary system of fixed currencies pegged to the dollar, which itself would be backed by America's gold reserves. The price of gold itself was fixed at $35 an ounce. Controls on the export of capital were put in place, and there was general support for the policies of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. He advocated a managed economy with monetary interventions by the central bank and tax changes by government to combat unemployment and inflation. These policies were effectively a class compromise, forced on the major powers by the soldiers returning from World War II, determined not to go back to conditions of unemployment and poverty that disfigured the pre-war period. Keynesianism laid the basis of the post-war economic boom, which produced full employment, increased living standards, and welfare states that provided directly financed public services like education, housing, and health, alongside social security benefits. Beneath the surface, however, the raw contradictions of the capitalist form of economy were eating away at the Keynesian welfare state system. Capital requires constant expansion to sustain the rate of profit. Bretton Woods was eventually to prove a kind of straitjacket. Corporations were blocked from significant investment outside of their country's borders, for example. Meanwhile, the dollar was losing its value, calling into question its convertibility into gold. On the 15th of August 1971, Bretton Woods became history when dollar convertibility was abandoned. A free-for-all in currency speculation began. The value of the dollar plunged, inflation soared. It reached 25% in the UK in 1975, leading to a tripling of oil prices by producers and a 3-day week in the UK. A massive recession gripped the world economy. It was curtains for the Keynesian way. For the ruling classes, what they were posed with was defeating a powerful trade union movement and changing political course so that capital could maintain its grip on the economy. Enter the neoliberals, stage right. In 1947, in opposition to Keynesianism, Austrian-British economist and philosopher Friedrich Hayek founded the Mont Pelerin Society in Switzerland. It included Milton Friedman, later a supporter of monetarism, among its thinkers. Hayek and Friedman led the way in advocating an open, market-driven economy which the state would encourage and help develop. This would replace the state-managed economy created out of Bretton Woods. Eventually, their theories began to find an echo in policy-making circles at the highest levels of the state and in actions by governments. In 1976, with unemployment soaring, inflation at 16%, and the pound under sustained attack, the Labour government negotiated a loan from the International Monetary Fund. It was the biggest in its history. But the loan was conditional on swinging public spending cuts. The Labour government's attacks on the working class led to the so-called Winter of Discontent of 1978-9 and a major confrontation with public sector unions. Shortly afterwards, Margaret Thatcher steered the Tories to a decisive election victory. The rest, as they say, is history. Bob Jessup, in From Thatcherism to New Labour, writes that, quotes, 1979 marked an important symbolic defeat for the post-war mode of economic regulations, its institutionalized class compromise between capital and labour, and its associated forms of crisis management. And in this sense, it greatly facilitated further development and consolidation of neoliberalism, end quote. Thatcher led successive governments that ruthlessly set out to end the social and political compromise that had characterized the 25 years following World War II. At the center of her project was the reshaping of the state in order to rebalance class interests in the UK in favour of capital. The Tory governments from 1979 to 1997 put early neoliberalism into practice. State assets like gas, water, electricity and the railways were privatised. Many local government services were outsourced. Vast areas like London's docklands were handed over to developers and planning restrictions scrapped to facilitate commercially led regeneration. A panoply of draconian laws against trade union activity outlawed mass picketing and solidarity action. The full force of the state, the police, the intelligence agencies and the army were deployed to confront the miners when they struck against pit closures in 1984. They returned a year later without an agreement, and the UK's trade union movement went into precipitate decline thereafter. The welfare state was savaged, and access to benefits made increasingly difficult. Among the most significant of all measures was Thatcher's 1983 agreement with the London Stock Exchange to restructure and essentially deregulate the UK's financial markets. When the City of London's Big Bang, as it was known, exploded in October 1986, electronic trading was introduced on the stock market in place of paper. Overseas investment banks were able to set up in the UK without restrictions. It was the start of finance-driven globalization that changed the shape and the nature of contemporary capitalism along neoliberal lines. A parallel process was launched in the United States when Ronald Reagan became president in 1981. Reagan needed no persuading about the virtues of neoliberalism. He implemented 25% across-the-board tax cuts, higher defense spending, began financial deregulation, and attacked the trade unions. The Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization staged a strike which was declared illegal. All the strikers were then sacked by the federal authorities. Neoliberalism had arrived. Neoliberalism was taken a step further by the Clinton administration, which promoted the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. This established a free trade area between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Clinton's administration accelerated the deregulation of the financial sector. The firewall between commercial and investment banking activities, introduced in the 1930s, was abolished. Clinton claimed that the new arrangements would, quote, enhance the stability of our financial services system, end quote, a case of famous last words, as we shall see. It was in Clinton's first term that the World Trade Organization came into existence, replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which had been part of the Bretton Woods financial architecture. The WTO went on to become a key facilitator of corporate-driven globalization, ruling against a whole range of measures designed to protect consumers and public services. It is the only international body whose rulings are accepted by the United States. The new global framework built by Thatcher, Reagan and Clinton was wholeheartedly embraced by Tony Blair and what was now New Labour. Before he came to power in 1997, Blair had already persuaded the trade unions to abandon the historic Socialist Clause 4 of the party's constitution with its explicit reference to the common ownership of the means of production. Labour then took the neoliberal transformation of Britain much further. The Blair-Brown governments were characterised by key policies which built on and extended previous Tory policies. These included a workfare policy that threatened sanctions against the unemployed who refused reasonable employment. Brown's first action as Chancellor was to make the state-owned Bank of England independent and told to concentrate on inflation and forget about financial and monetary oversight. A light-touch self-regulation for the banking sector, which encouraged the growth of speculative financial instruments, was implemented. The marketisation of education through tuition fees for university students and privately run academy schools was pushed through. An internal market in the National Health Service with foundation hospital trusts that could operate like big business was created. So-called private finance initiatives impose huge costs on the construction of public buildings like hospitals. There are currently over 700 operational private finance deals with a capital value of around £60 billion. Annual interest charges for these deals amount to over £10 billion a year. Even if no new deals are entered into, future charges, which continue until the 2040s, amount to nearly £200 billion. There was a rapid increase in outsourcing of local authority services and an emphasis on home ownership in place of social housing. Thatcherite anti-union laws were retained. Tax credits eventually subsidized low wages, and a range of authoritarian laws brought in under the guise of the War on Terror. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 on a tissue of lies and misinformation was a neoliberal project. Its aim was to turn Iraq into a market economy in the image of the United States and Britain. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died as the neoliberal fantasy destroyed a country. Then the financial system went into meltdown in 2007-8, made more inevitable by the deregulation that had preceded it. The state bailed out the banks, and neoliberalism went into a crisis that it is yet to recover from. The Clinton-Blair years, which can now be identified as the second phase of neoliberalism, led to a transformation in the way the state intervened in economic affairs and how the state itself was orientated. Sociology professor Steve Lukes, in an article called Invasion of the Market, writes about how privatization and outsourcing has severed what he calls the essential link between voter and representative at national and local level. He says, and I quote, "Marketization has enabled politicians to divest themselves of responsibility and, crucially, accountability for the provision of public services." End quote. Outsourcing and privatization leads to a whole class of commissioners, regulators and auditors who exist outside of the political system and are therefore unaccountable in any meaningful sense. In the UK, industry regulators cover basic services like energy supply, transport, telecoms, food standards and financial conduct. There are over 90 regulatory bodies with an annual budget of around £4 billion a year. Regulators are charged with the protection not of citizens' rights, but citizens in their reinvented guise as consumers. Meanwhile, workers in the public sector, like teachers and NHS staff, are bombarded with demands to quantify their work in order to demonstrate value for money. Schools are dominated by data collection practices that can overwhelm and restrict creative teaching. As we have noted, a range of formerly public activities like prison management have been transferred to arm's-length agencies, while immigration and deportation centres have simply been privatised. The early period of capitalism in Britain was characterised by liberalism as opposed to the neo-version. But what's the difference? The critical theorist Benjamin Noyes explains in The Grammar of Neoliberalism that classical liberalism began from the proposition that the state should not interfere and allow the market to determine outcomes. In its 21st century reincarnation, also known as neoliberalism, the state itself is reorganized, using a phrase borrowed from the French philosopher Michel Foucault, under the supervision of the market. Foucault adds that neoliberalism intervenes in society so that competitive mechanisms can play a regulatory role at every moment to achieve what he calls the objective of a general regulation of society by the market. Whether neoliberalism is as conscious a thing as Foucault suggests is another matter, but his central point about the role of the market in politics and society is dead right. Bob Jessup makes the crucial and critical point that neoliberal globalization tends towards the destabilization of the political system. This is reflected, he says, in the shift from government to governance. There is, he adds, a movement away from the central role of the official state apparatus in securing state-sponsored economic and social projects. The emphasis, says Jessup, is on partnership, in which the state apparatus is often only the first among equals. Similar points are made by William Davies, who teaches at Goldsmiths in London and has written extensively on the culture of neoliberalism. He explains that the rise of outsourcing is not towards privatization pure and simple. Rather, it expresses something new, that is, a complex alliance between the state and the market. Power and agency, he says, end up in an ambiguous space of governance, somewhere between the two. In these conditions, the state and the market blend into one another, says Davies. A clear expression of this new relationship between capital and the state is in the growth of lobbying as an industry. There are an estimated 4,000 people working as lobbyists on behalf of big business, with an estimated budget of £2 billion a year. Only a small part of the process is monitored when meetings involve ministers or permanent secretaries of government departments are involved. As for the rest, there's no transparency at all. Obvious scandals like ex-Prime Minister Cameron lobbying ministers on behalf of a dodgy financial company disguise more covert operations. Lobbyists try to influence the rules around licenses like mobile phone networks. Companies and industry bodies have an interest in shaping the nature or implementation of regulations, and they work closely with civil servants on drafting them. Lobbying is a €1 billion industry in the European Union. There are an astonishing 30,000 lobbyists in Brussels, just about one for each member of staff employed by the European Commission. New draft regulations are run past industry lobbyists, in effect for approval and redrafting, before they come into force. So, to sum up, the differences between the neoliberal state and what came before it is marked. These include the liberalisation of trade, capital movement and finance, beneficial corporate tax regimes, anti-union practices allowed by firms like Amazon and Walmart, the emphasis on individualism and identity, and a reliance on market-led solutions to global challenges like climate change. In the next session, we'll look at the role of ideas and ideology in sustaining support for the present political and economic system.